Taphophobia is the fear of being buried alive as a result of being incorrectly pronounced dead. And a while back we did a video on how people back in the day tried to make sure you were really dead in order to avoid this fate. And the methods were often pretty brutal and ineffective. But you wouldn't be pronounced dead and then buried if you weren't actually dead today, right? Before we begin, we post death and dying related videos every Friday. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, consider subscribing to the channel. Now let's talk the likelihood of being buried alive today. How does being buried alive kill you? Premature burial can lead to death through the following: asphyxiation, dehydration, starvation, and in cold climates, hypothermia. A person trapped with fresh air to breathe can last a considerable time. But this all assumes that you've been buried in a sturdy coffin or casket that can withstand the weight of the dirt on top of it. And it probably doesn't need to be said, but if you've opted for a more natural burial and you're just wrapped in a shroud, you're pretty screwed from the beginning. And now that I think about it, those steel caskets and vaults that protect the casket from dirt and all that are so commonly used in the US could be seen as a blessing or a curse in this situation. Conditions that look like death. In the modern day, if you live somewhere with a decent healthcare system, it is extremely unlikely that you will ever be buried alive because you've been mistakenly pronounced dead. But back in the day, they didn't know that much about the body as we do now, and certain conditions can make you appear very dead. Hysterical paralysis, Guillain-Barré syndrome, cardiac dysrhythmia, strokes, certain infectious diseases, and cataplexy, a nervous disorder that replicates the stiffness in muscles like rigor mortis, slows breathing, and decreases sensitivity to pain. Now these are all very rare conditions, but it's not difficult to see how they would have been written off as death back in the day. Nowadays though, we have plenty of tests and scans that can be done to test for these conditions. Historic cases. In 1937, 19-year-old Frenchman Angelo Hayes crashed his motorbike and slammed headfirst into a brick wall. When help arrived, they found Hayes' head was mangled and he had no pulse that they could feel. He was declared dead and buried 3 days later. However, due to an investigation by the insurance company, Hayes' body was exhumed 2 days later, and they were quite surprised to find that his body was still warm. It appeared in the aftermath of the accident that his body had put itself into a deep coma and required very little oxygen to keep its system going. He was taken for proper medical care and went on to make a miraculous full recovery. No word on what happened to the insurance payout though. An earlier case was that of Octavia Smith in the 1800s in USA. After her young son died, Octavia went into a deep depression and was bedridden for several months. During this time, she began to show signs of a mysterious illness. Eventually, her body entered a coma-like state and nobody could awaken her. She was pronounced dead in May of 1891, just 4 months after her son's death. It was unusually hot May that year, and so Octavia was quickly buried, embalming not being a common practice yet. But a few days later, others in the town began falling into similar coma-like sleeps with shallow breathing patterns, only to awaken a few days later. They discovered the illness was caused by a bite of the tsetse fly. Fearing that she had been buried alive, James, her husband, panicked and had Octavia exhumed, thinking she might have awakened. And she had, but James was too late. And he found the coffin lining had been shredded and Octavia's fingernails were bloody. A traumatized James reburied Octavia and erected a lifelike monument on her that sits in the cemetery where she rests in today. Many other cases throughout history have been reported, but their legitimacy is questioned. These two cases we know happened due to the multiple eyewitness accounts, police and hospital reports. Historical prevention. Before the medical field really worked out how to pronounce someone dead correctly, there were many attempts to avoid such fates by the regular person. Indeed, such was the concern that in 1896, the London Association for the Prevention of Premature Burial was co-founded. But what did people come up with? Well, in 1886, the improved burial case was patented in the US. It stated that the tomb is equipped with a number of features, including an air inlet, a ladder and a bell, so that the person, upon awakening, could save themselves. If too weak to ascend by the ladder, he can ring the bell, giving the desired alarm for help, and thus save himself from premature death by being very alive, the patent explains. In 1882, a patent titled "Device for Indicating Life in Buried Person" was granted. This version had a means for indicating movement as well as a way of getting fresh air into the coffin. The disclosure states that it will be seen that if a person buried should come to life, a motion of his hand will turn the branch of the T-shaped pipe upon or near which his hand is placed. A marked scale on the side of the top indicates movement of the T, and air passively comes down the pipe. Once sufficient time has passed to assure that the person is dead, the device can be removed. Then in 1885, the simply named burial casket pattern was granted. This invention said that it provided improvements in the important components of previous buried alive inventions. In this instance, motion of the body triggers a clockwork-driven fan which will force fresh, breathable air into the coffin instead of a passive air pipe. The device also includes a battery-powered alarm. It's said that when the hand is moved, the exposed part of the wire will come in contact with the body, completing the circuit between the alarm and the ground to the body in the coffin, and the alarm will sound. There is also a spring-loaded rod which will raise up, carrying feathers or other signals. Additionally, a tube is positioned over the face of the buried person so that a lamp can be introduced down the tube, and a person looking down through the tube can see the face of the body in the coffin. As I'm sure you can imagine, not many of these were sold or even put into production, and there certainly hasn't been any case of them actually saving someone. Modern cases. There are plenty of cases floating around the internet of people being buried alive, having been pronounced dead, but there is very little by way to back up these accounts other than the often hysterical family members saying, well, she didn't have those bruises before she was buried, which could very easily be explained by decomp. Kind of like how people back in the day assumed a corpse was a vampire if they had fluid coming out of their mouth, assuming that it was blood that they had been drinking, but we now know was just fluid being purged due to decomp. So no substantially confirmed cases of someone being pronounced dead when they weren't and then being buried. There are, however, stories of people being not quite fully murdered, being buried by their would-be murderer. There are stories of people having been purposefully buried alive by gangs or abusive partners. Stories of people being buried alive after landslides or building collapse. And the occasional story of, I woke up in a body bag, or he woke up at the morgue, or she woke up at her own funeral, which I would say is really not anywhere close to being buried alive. Does this mean that it doesn't happen anymore though? Well, to be frank, we'll never really know. Because the only real way you would know it had happened is if one day you need to exhume the body and open the casket, which is extremely rare. And by the time they've done that, you're probably already a skeleton and the casket has naturally started falling apart anyway, so it's kind of hard to tell. But if I was to place a large bet on it, I would say it was highly likely that at least a couple of people around the world were buried alive during the COVID pandemic. We know it happened during other widespread disease outbreaks where bodies were buried in a hurry. And sure, it may have been in rural areas with limited health services, but yeah, it probably did happen. So I suppose we can say there is a plus to embalming, because you will definitely not be buried alive if you've been embalmed. I can guarantee you that. If you know of any modern day case of someone being buried alive having been pronounced dead that has substantial evidence to back it up, let us know in the comments. And if this is a fear of yours and you want help working through it, please know you can always book an online consult with us via our website. The plus side of our over-medicalized system is that being buried alive is almost impossible. And with that, go talk death.